We might need it. It's not from what we have seen.
No.
On the other one, it's fine.
5, 6. Oh no.
No! That's to flare up that.
It doesn't look that bad though.
No worries. See if you can see like any of the letters. I mean, you probably can't.
Not really. All right, boys, gather round. There's been a murder. Exactly. Uh-oh. We have 2 suspects. David Long. He is apparently 16 years old, and he has an occupation of being a criminal. Our second suspect, Ricky. Age, 82. Occupation, common thief. All right, boys, break.
So, there's been a murder. Here's what we know. The murder was filmed on one of 2 cameras, the Panavision Millenium XL2 35mm film camera, or the Panavision Millenium DXL2 digital cinema camera. In order to decipher which of these cameras was used in the filming of the murder, we will be performing several image quality analyses on both the film and digital footages. It will be through this comparison that we identify the suspicious camera and, by association, the suspect most likely to have been the killer. With only these few leads to go off of, we began by reaching out to Panavision New York to inquire about any suspicious characters having rented any equipment. Unfortunately, no rental logs were kept at the time of the murder. However, with kindness and generosity, Panavision allowed our detectives to take out both the DXL2 and XL2 cameras for the advancement of our investigation. Is it possible that a murder captured on the DXL2 could be mistaken for that which was captured on a film camera like the XL2? For comparison, we utilized Kodak 5219 Vision 3 500T color negative film as our alternative capture medium. The DXL2 utilizes an 8K red monstro sensor. Footage is captured as log 3G10 encoding and red-white color gamut. Therefore, some of our assessments, such as our resolution analysis, were conducted with the sensor in 8K resolution, while the remaining analyses were conducted at 4K resolution. Separately, our film was scanned via a Blackmagic Cintel scanner at a resolution of 2K. The output of the scan is a Cineon log encoding. A Cineon digital negative is represented as printing density, or in other words, the printing density that would otherwise be, in a way, witnessed by the print film. Log 3G10 is similar in that it represents a printing density encoding. However, visual differences arise through the variations between log 3G10 and Vision 3. Upon reviewing the murder footage, we realized that a LUT had been applied. Not just any LUT, a Rec 709 Kodak 2383 print film emulation LUT, conveniently available in DaVinci Resolve. Therefore, we applied this LUT to both the Cineon log scanner output as well as the log 3G10 digital camera output. A result of our Cintel scan, we were forced to drive up the exposure on our Cineon log footage to compensate for a calibration issue. Additional color correction, apart from any exposure correction, was performed after the print film emulation LUT was applied to both footages. In all cases of color correction, our LUT applied film footage was utilized as our ideal, and all remaining film or digital footages were lift gamma gain color corrected to meet the neutrals of the film at normal exposure.
For our analysis of image detail, we will be utilizing 2 metrics to describe how detail is perceived by an observer. The first metric, sharpness, is tied to the perception of edge contrast. If an image is regarded as sharp, it will be subjectively easier to identify the edge contrast differences in an image. Separately, our second metric, resolving power, is used to characterize how an imaging system is able to distinguish between objects or details that are close in angular distance. When examining the fine details of our crime scene, we note that the sharpness surrounding the letters on the pin board decreases as we move from the 8K resolution to the 4K resolution, and again from the 4K resolution to the 2K Cintel film scan. The primary takeaway is that as the resolution of our images decrease, so too does the sharpness around these letters. Separately, when examining the detail of the crudely drawn question mark, we see that the 4K and 2K images are increasingly unable to distinguish the differences between individual marker strokes, while the 8K image has no issue with depicting this detail.
So right now we are doing our HDR scene for our MPS Shootout, featuring the MPS class of 2021, 2. I don't know. It's going great. We pretty much did this all on the spot, and we're still working on it. It's been about 3-4 hours, but we're doing fantastic.
On the left, we have our scene captured by the XL2 film camera, and on the right, we have the DXL2 digital footage, both after the print film emulation LUT has been applied. There are 3 phases to the scene. Phase 1, where everything is underexposed, Phase 2, where everything was exposed normally, and Phase 3, where everything was overexposed. But to compare the dynamic range capabilities of the film and of the digital camera, we will be using the Cineon log printing density values from the film and the log3 G10 values of the digital footage. Comparing using the PFV footage is possible, but the use of a creative LUT doesn't accurately represent each camera's capabilities to their fullest extent. The PFV adds significant contrast to the image while blowing up the highlights and dragging down the shadows. While making our dynamic range comparison, we want our highlights and shadows to be altered as little as possible. The digital camera vastly outperforms the film in the underexposed part of the scene. The film is flat and noisy, whereas the digital footage has clear detail. In the normal shot, some detail in the shadows are still lost in the film footage, but the digital performs well. In the highlight scene, however, film starts to outperform digital. Film has higher capabilities in the highlights and keeps more details than the digital can. Next, we investigate the shadows and highlights of the scene, starting with the shadows. We have underexposed each camera by 1 and 2 stops of light to examine how much detail is kept. The digital footage with the creative LUT applied keeps the details fairly well, even when underexposed by 2 stops. The film, however, has become completely unusable, has kept no detail and is extremely noisy. In both cameras, the overexposure has not been kind in the highlights. We can see that little detail in the curtain is kept in the light in both cameras. However, this is the footage with the creative print film emulation LUT applied, and therefore does not tell the whole story of exposure latitude of either camera. Again, the film is flat, noisy, and unusable, while the digital is rather noisy but keeps some detail and is usable. Now, we see that the film is much better at handling overexposure, especially in the highlights. There is much more detail in the curtain in the film footage than there is in the digital footage. The print film emulation also has its uses other than being a creative LUT and making a prettier picture. It also boosts the contrast of shadowy areas, creating a wider range of shadows.
Okay, so, I have to talk to you guys about color reproduction for the case. But I think that there are too many years around, and with this being like a murder, I'm gonna have to take you guys, we should probably go into my office. It's a little bit more discreet. I like to think of it, as my second home. But anyways, let's get on to talking about the color reproduction. It's in the name. The Millenium DXL2 was designed as the next step in the Panavision Millenium film camera series. Despite being one of the first digital cinema cameras in the line, second only to the original DXL, the DXL2 strives to combine the color reproduction advantages of both film and digital mediums, particularly in providing the user with the tools necessary to emulate the color appearance found within a typical DI workflow. By many at Panavision, the DXL2 is regarded as yielding ideally filmic color reproduction. Following Panavision's recommendations for a print film emulation workflow, we intended to utilize one of the camera's optional LUTs to provide our images with a print film emulation comparable to that which we had achieved with the 5219 film. However, despite following the Panavision user guide on how to apply the provided LUTs to our images, the results demonstrated color reproduction qualities that were less than ideal. Therefore, we opted to apply a Kodak 2383 Rec 709 print film emulation LUT to the base Log3G10 digital footage, the same LUT that was applied to our film footage. After the application of the PFE LUT to both footages, one will instantly witness a disparity in saturation. Examining the 24 patch Macbeth chart under normal exposure, the digital DXL2 images look significantly desaturated in comparison with the 5219 patches. This can be attributed to the differences in gamut between the Cineon log and Log3G10 red wide gamut encodings. Due to the variation in size between the two color gamuts, with red wide gamut demonstrating a much larger area than that of Cineon log, there is a need for gamut mapping between these spaces for an accurate comparison of saturation. However, even with this missing piece of the puzzle, we can still analyze hue differences between the mediums. For reference, the neutral ramps on the DXL2 footage were corrected to equal the code values of the film footage. Compared to the film, the patches of the DXL2 appear significantly blue. This can primarily be witnessed in the magenta, yellow, and red patches. For the patches intended to have green content, the lime, green, and yellow patches, the overall presence of green is greatly reduced. The skin tones in the upper left also appear to have deviated in hue. Further exploring these skin tones, one can witness that the PFE applied 5219 skin tones appear much more natural than their digital counterparts. For the three demonstrated skin tones, the film images demonstrate a much greater presence of red, while the DXL2 skin tones appear to be washed out, cooler, and somewhat void of their natural color appearance. Ultimately, the skin tones of the film workflow are favorably warm and rich. Though the 5219 workflow prevails in yielding ideal color reproduction at normal exposure, there are significant changes to color reproduction under varying levels of exposure. For the Macbeth charts overexposed by 2 stops, there appears to be a slight increase of saturation from the normal. This can be seen primarily in the yellows, reds, and skin tones. However, this disparity in color reproduction is greatest with underexposure. The underexposed patches are extremely lifeless and washed out compared to the normal and overexposed alternatives. Separately, there is something to be said about the consistency of color reproduction in the digital imagery. For the DXL2 exposure series, there is a greater consistency in the color appearance across all levels of exposure. Even when underexposed by 2 stops, the DXL2 PFE workflow results in images that retain their saturation and do not noticeably deviate in hue. However, the noise becomes intrusive at this level of exposure. In examining a composite shot for both the film and 4K video, one can immediately witness that the film struggles to allow for effective background replacement in areas of the water picture and water. For this sequence, a chroma key was applied to both footages. No further manipulation of sharpness or noise reduction were applied, as we wanted to test the effectiveness of the composite in the direct outputs for both our film PFE and digital PFE workflows. Because of the automatic sharpening in the DXL2, this camera consistently yields images that are better for easy green screen keying. Again, if noise reduction and sharpening were applied to the film prior to compositing, we would likely achieve an improved result. After reviewing the differences in image quality between the two cameras, it is very clear that, within this workflow, the DXL2 does not exhibit many of the same qualities as the 5219 film. Is this to say that the DXL2 is incapable of yielding a filmic image? Absolutely not. However, our analysis confirms that it is better to say that the DXL2 has the capability to provide a film look than to say that the DXL2 will always yield filmic imagery. After discovering that Ricky was, in fact, not a professional colorist, we were left with only one conclusion. On May 11th, 2021, David Long was arrested for first-degree manslaughter. His last words to authorities were, "Film is not dead, but that man sure is."